All right, ready to unlock some serious language learning secrets? We know you want to conquer English, and quickly. We've been analyzing this awesome podcast episode, and let me tell you, it is jam-packed with tips and tricks. We can't wait to share the best ones with you.
What I really liked about this podcast is how they break everything down. It's not just throwing a ton of techniques at you at once. It's super strategic, and that makes it way less overwhelming.
Yeah, exactly. They start by tackling vocabulary, which can feel like a huge mountain to climb, right? But their approach to it was really interesting.
Oh, yeah, the whole contextual learning thing. I'm a big fan of that. It's so much better than just memorizing words from a list.
Like that example they gave, remember? Learning the word serene by picturing a peaceful lake at sunrise.
So smart. It's like creating a mental movie. That's how our brains work best, making those connections.
Like how we learn our friends' names, not by memorizing them, but by associating them with all the fun times we have together.
Exactly. And the podcast had some other cool tricks for vocab, too, like grouping words by themes. Makes total sense, right?
Yeah, instead of random words, it's like learning travel words or cooking words or whatever you're into.
It creates these mental webs, and then there's collocations words that usually go together, like you wouldn't say powerful rain, would you?
You'd say heavy rain. So it's about learning those natural chunks.
It's like learning chords on a guitar instead of just individual notes. Makes you sound smoother. And the podcast mentioned this cool trick for learning collocations.
Oh, yeah.
Spaced repetition. Have you heard of that?
I think so. It's not just cramming words, is it?
Nope. It's all about timing. Like reviewing words at specific intervals. It actually strengthens those connections in your brain.
Like a brain workout. So we've got mental pictures, thematic grouping, collocations, and spaced repetition. What else stood out to you?
Sometimes the simplest things are best. The podcast really emphasized using a vocabulary journal.
Oh, yeah. I tried that before. It does help. It makes those words feel like yours, not just random words on a page.
Exactly. Okay, so we've covered vocabulary. What about grammar? It can be kind of scary, right?
Totally. So many rules. But the podcast had a really practical approach.
Oh, tell me.
They said to start with the core tenses, first, present, past, and future. Get those down before moving on.
Makes sense. Like building a house, you need a solid foundation before you start adding all the fancy stuff.
Exactly. And the podcast had some cool tips for that fancy stuff, too.
Like?
Using linking words, because, although, however, that kind of thing.
So you're not just saying simple sentences. You're connecting your ideas in a more sophisticated way.
Right. But the real key, they said, is to actually use the grammar, not just memorize the rules.
Like you wouldn't just read a cookbook to learn how to cook, right? You'd get in the kitchen and try stuff out.
Exactly. So maybe write about your day using different tenses, or describe your hobbies.
Put those grammar rules into action. That's how you really learn.
Okay, so vocabulary and grammar. But what about listening? That can be a tough one.
For sure. It's easy to just zone out when you're listening to English, but the podcast had a great point about active listening.
Meaning you're not just hewing the words, you're really trying to process them.
Exactly. Like summarizing what you've heard, pausing if you need to, or even taking notes.
Oh, and have you ever tried shadowing? It's helped me a lot with listening.
Oh, yeah, shadowing. It's like you're trying to copy the speaker's every word, their rhythm, everything.
It really trains your ear. And speaking of training, the podcast also mentioned how important it is to choose listening material that's right for your level.
Yeah, starting with simpler stuff, then gradually working your way up.
Like climbing a staircase.
Right.
One step at a time. And they had a really interesting tip about subtitles.
Ooh, tell me about it.
They said to start with subtitles in your own language, then switch to English subtitles, and eventually try to listen without any subtitles at all.
It's like training wheels for your ears. I love that. All right, so we've talked about vocabulary, grammar, and listening. But there's one big thing we haven't talked about yet.
You mean speaking, the thing that everyone gets nervous about.
Exactly. But the podcast had some surprisingly simple tips for overcoming that fear. Welcome back. You know, what really stood out to me was how much the podcast focused on mindset. Like how you think about learning a language can really make or break your success.
Oh, yeah. It's like having all the best tools, but not knowing how to use them. The podcast talked a lot about fear, especially when it comes to speaking.
Fear can be such a huge roadblock.
Yeah.
But they had this great tip about reframing mistakes.
Like not seeing them as failures, but as opportunities to learn.
Exactly. They even said, to think of mistakes as feedback. Like, okay, I messed up there, but what can I learn from it?
It's so true. I used to get so embarrassed when I'd make a mistake in English, but now I try to see it as part of the process.
And the podcast also talked about celebrating small victories. Like, did you nail a grammar rule today? Awesome. Give yourself a high five.
It's easy to get caught up in the big goal of fluency and forget about those little wins along the way.
Totally. And speaking of motivation, what did you think about their tips for staying inspired?
Oh, they had some really good ones. Like remembering your why.
Right. Why are you even learning English in the first place?
Is it to travel? To connect with people from different cultures? To get a better job? Having a clear purpose can really help you push through those tough moments.
Yeah, it's like having a compass that keeps you pointed in the right direction. They even talked about making a vision board.
Oh, yeah, with pictures and words that represent your goals.
I love that idea. It's like creating a visual reminder of what you're working towards. But it's not just about dreaming big. They also said it's important to set realistic goals.
Right, like don't expect to be fluent overnight. Instead, break down your journey into smaller steps.
Exactly. If you're trying to climb a mountain, you don't just focus on the summit, right?
They focus on reaching the next base camp. Those smaller goals feel so much more achievable.
Absolutely.
Hmm?
And speaking of support, they also talked about the importance of finding a language learning community.
Oh, that's so key. Connecting with other learners can make such a difference.
It's like having a team of cheerleaders who are going through the same challenges as you.
And you can celebrate successes together, share tips, and just encourage each other.
That's awesome. The podcast also mentioned the importance of finding resources that match your learning style.
Oh, yeah, like whether you're a visual learner, an auditory learner, or a kinesthetic learner.
It's all about personalizing your approach. Like if you love watching movies, maybe you watch movies in English with subtitles.
Or if you're a music lover, you could focus on learning English through songs.
Make it fun. It shouldn't feel like a chore. There was one more thing that really resonated with me from this podcast.
What was that?
They talked about the importance of self-awareness in language learning.
Like knowing your strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly. And then using that knowledge to create a learning plan that actually works for you.
It's like being the architect of your own learning journey. I love that. But even with a great plan, there will be times when you feel stuck or frustrated.
Oh yeah, for sure. Learning a language takes time and effort.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
And the podcast really emphasized the importance of being patient with yourself.
It's so easy to get discouraged when you don't see results right away. But it's about trusting the process.
Exactly. Don't give up on your dream of speaking English fluently. Okay, before we move on to the last part of our deep dive, we want to hear from you.
How do you personalize your language learning?
What keeps you motivated when things get tough? Share your thoughts with us, and we'll be back soon to wrap up our deep dive with some final takeaways.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of great advice for learning English. Let's try to sum up some of those key takeaways. What really stuck with you?
One thing that kept coming up again and again was the importance of active learning, right? Like you got to actually do stuff, not just sit back and listen.
Exactly. You can't just watch someone play basketball and expect to become a pro yourself. You got to get out there and practice.
In this podcast, they gave so many good examples of how to do that. Shadowing, active listening, using grammar in real situations. It's all about actually using the language.
And consistency, too. Even just a little bit each day can make a big difference over time.
Like those 15 minutes a day they talked about,
Mm.
that felt so doable, you know. You don't need hours and hours to make progress.
Little by little, it adds up. I liked how they emphasized making learning fun, too. It shouldn't feel like a chore.
Right. They were all about finding what works for you. Watch movies, listen to music, whatever you enjoy.
Make it your own. So important.
Oh, and one more thing, mindset. You got to believe in yourself.
That can be tough, especially when you make mistakes. It's easy to get discouraged.
Totally. But the podcast reminded us that mistakes are part of the process.
There are opportunities to learn and grow.
Exactly. All right, before we wrap up, let's leave everyone with a little something to think about. If you could have a conversation with anyone in the world in fluent English, who would it be and what would you talk about?
Imagine that conversation, feeling totally confident, expressing yourself perfectly.
Let that be your motivation, your driving force.
Remember, learning a language takes time, so be patient with yourself. Celebrate the small wins and never give up on your dream.
That's it for our deep dive today. We hope you got some great tips and feel inspired to keep learning.
Happy practicing, everyone. Catch you on the next deep dive.